Life Audio.
Hey, welcome to God's Love for the Unlovable. I'm Dr. Bill Sinyard with Gospel at Ministries. We're in our series, God's Love for the Unlovable, Advent, Christmas. By the way, Merry Christmas. What happens when God's love for the unlovable, the unloved, and the unlovely, and that's all of us on any given day, if we're just honest, what happens if it bumps into those who are clearly not lovable, or at least they don't feel lovable or worthy or relevant? So what goes down? What does it feel like, look like? What difference does it make to us today? And again, since it's Christmas, we're focused upon characters and institutions in the account of Jesus' birth. So the temple, the enigmatic Simeon, the mysterious Magi. But today, we're going to look at what appears to be an irrelevant priest, Zechariah. So was Zech irrelevant? Well, yes, and definitely no. So let's have some holiday fun. Welcome to God's Love for the Unlovable. We'll get started after a quick word from our sponsors. Irrelevant. Not connected with or relevant to something, having no bearing on or connection with the subject at issue, not integral to the important matters swirling around them, who don't make any difference. They're bench sitters. Yeah? Some synonyms: extraneous, immaterial, inconsequential, insignificant, pointless, trivial, and unimportant. Well, I don't know. I felt like that at times. What would it look like for a temple priest to become or feel irrelevant? Meet Zechariah in Luke 1. In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were upright in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commandments and regulations blamelessly. Luke 1, 5-6. So Zechariah, Zech, was an aging priest in the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem, likely following in the sandals of his father and his father's father before him. He was of the tribe of Levi, of Aaron. To serve as a priest was the family business. It was the family calling, and he apparently did it faithfully. And yet, I imagine that he often wondered, what's the point? Am I making a difference here? I'll explain it. To be perfectly clear, Zechariah was not irrelevant. He was wildly relevant, as we'll see as the story unfolds, but I suspect he was not feeling it when our story begins. It's another example of what could happen when God and God's love for the overlooked, the frustrated, the unacclaimed, the shamed, the inconsequential, and of course those who feel irrelevant. What happens when God's love bumps into them? And in this case, one of the good guys, a faithful priest who's faithfully serving in a corrupt temple institution. Remember the last show? And this institution hadn't experienced the presence of God in perhaps 5 centuries. And everyone knows his story now, if you've read the Christmas account. Zechariah will finally, for the first time perhaps in his long life, feel really honored, special, remembered. And by the way, ironically, his name means God remembers, right? He's going to feel relevant. In fact, he's going to become one of the most important men or women in the birth account of the Messiah. And granted, he still only rarely makes an appearance in modern Christmas celebrations, right? Few carols are sung about him. Few sermons tell his story. But boy, he is relevant. And I suspect that, humanly speaking, he could not possibly have expected what God had in mind for him. Well, when Luke begins the story of Jesus' birth, right, the incarnation, he begins with Zechariah. He will be the second person that we know of. I mean, Mary was the first person visited by an angel of God in the New Testament. And before that, half a millennia before that we know of. And I think he's going to be the most surprised. Well, Mary was pretty surprised too. All right, no judgment from me. I'm suggesting that by the time all of these events happened, he was likely feeling inconsequential and irrelevant. What am I doing here? Right? Check it out. Let me know if you agree. So background. The 18,000 temple priests were divided into 24 groups with 4 to 9 families in each group. These were regular priesthood, not the powerful, wealthy, elite Sadducean high priest and their family and entourage, who around the time of Jesus were corrupt political appointees of King Herod. I talked about in the last show, really crime families. They ran the temple business like crime lords with violence and bribery and oppression, anything to stay in power. And again, I spoke about that in detail in the last show. In fact, Simon Boethus, likely the high priest when Zechariah had his angelic vision, was the father-in-law of King Herod, and likely given that profitable appointment to give Herod's marriage some political validity, an ancient quid pro quo. And Simon had a reputation of being not only corrupt, but violent, beating the regular priests like Zechariah with staves. Par for the course, Simon Boethus will be abruptly removed from office by an angry, paranoid Herod under suspicions of treason, trying to undermine Herod's thrones. Like Herod is dying, he's becoming more and more paranoid and violent. So look, the temple was no safe place. At its highest level, the high priesthood was rife with politics, corruption, violence, and bribery. Having said that, as best as we can tell, the rituals and the offerings within the temple were to the letter, but behind the scene, the temple institution was broken, an anathema to God. Now, I have little doubt that the faithful, righteous priests like Zech saw all of this and would have likely felt critical or bitter or jealous. They would have been afraid of God's displeasure, or maybe just felt helpless and powerless, wondering if they were passively part of the whole thing, enabling all of the corruption, right? So in a word, they would have felt irrelevant. So what difference does all of his service make when the temple's corrupt from the top down? How could God be pleased no matter how many sacrifices they do and how right they do them? Certainly, God can't be pleased with his temple. This is what Zechariah would have been thinking. And that was the point of all of the work of the 18,000 priests. They were going through these things in order to gain God's favor, to please God, to worship God. Said, look, I don't need to guess what God thinks about it. In 30 years, God's going to come, Jesus, right, to the temple, toss the money exchange tables, very upset and righteously angry. But what could Zechariah do? And by the way, it gets worse. And this is not very well known. Zechariah and the other priests served in the temple only 2 weeks out of the year, and perhaps at the three main festivals as well. But while serving, his home would be one of the chambers set apart for the priest on the sides of the temple grounds. And there he would at least enjoy a portion of the grain and the meat that was brought as sacrifices. All right, that's 2 weeks. The rest of the year, he and the other priests would have to provide for their own family's needs. The Torah specified that the priests and the Levites were given portions of land around various cities to work, right, scattered throughout the land. So herdsmen, farmers, potters, weavers, craftsmen, that was their livelihood and how they would raise their families as best as they could. But, you know, we suspect during the Roman period with all the corruption, the old rules were a little fluid, and likely the priests and the Levites, the regular ones like Zechariah, had tough goes. Unlike the high priest and his Jerusalem entourage, few priests who lived outside of Jerusalem, and likely Zach and Liz lived in Ein Kerem, outside the strangling control of the high priest, they would have struggled to survive. It would have been very difficult. They would have lived in relative poverty, likely. And yet, Zechariah and his wife remained faithful to their calling. Luke notes the piety of both husband and wife. Aaron was a priest in good standing. So the words basically mean that. They describe him almost like a superhuman saint, but that's not the point. They weren't sinless. Only Jesus will be sinless. He was a priest ordained without stain or blemish on his official record. He knew the law. He was familiar with all of the additional regulations of service and piety, and he did them intentionally and to the very best of his ability. And the same could be said with Elizabeth. She too was of the tribe of Aaron. This was a blessed marriage according to custom. Priests were to marry virgin Israelites, to marry virgin daughters of the priestly class. That's a bonus. These were a righteous couple, right? But was all of the righteousness worth it? If God was watching, which, by the way, is hard to see and know, would God have been happy with the priesthood? Was Zechariah and the other faithful priests wasting their times? Well, this is as good as any. Time to stop, get a brief word from our sponsors. We'll be right back. You know, it feels like I'm piling on Zechariah, but I'm just telling you what he was dealing with. He and Liz were likely well past midlife, maybe 60 or 70, but in that day, that's pretty old. Well past the time most would have had children or even grandchildren. They would have enjoyed, past the time of enjoying raising the next generation of sons and daughters. And some certainly would be called, the next gen of priests to continue the family calling. But not for Zach and Liz. God had not given them a child, boy or girl. And perhaps they may have wondered at times why God had withheld that blessing from them. It's frustrating. What legacy did these faithful people, these righteous Jews have? Zach and Liz. To not have children in that day and that culture made you wonder if God wasn't happy with you or had just stopped taking notice of you. Back to the irrelevancy thing. Children were a blessing from the Lord. So therefore, if you have no children, you do the math. The suspicion was that you were not being blessed, maybe even cursed. So you and your spouse must have done something or not done something that made God withhold a blessing that would certainly be due a righteous priest and a righteous spouse, right? If God won't bless them, the righteous men and women, then who would ever get on God's good side? It was a horrible visual for the entire priesthood, right? I would guess that Zechariah's presence in the temple cafeteria was an open sore, an unaddressed question. Hey, brother, have you tried some more offerings? Or, that offering for the unknown sin, you maybe do a couple of those. Or are you being honest? What about Liz? You get it, right? Rumors, whispers. And there's one more thing. In all of his many years of service, Zech had never been chosen by lot to do the offering of incense. That was a special honor. So like I said, the priests served at the temple twice a year and only for 1 week each time. The offering of incense was one of the most solemn parts of the daily worship of the temple, and lots were drawn each day to determine who should have this great honor. It's an honor which no priest could enjoy more than once during his lifetime. But old man Zach had never been chosen for this honor, right? It's suspicious. See, and again, it's just another data point of his possible feeling of irrelevancy. It was God alone who chose. It was God who would have withheld this honor. Why would he choose this childless old man? Well, I found this. I think it's interesting to kind of give you an idea of the day-to-day ritual, the order of worship of service in the temple. It's a long reading, so just bear with me. You get an idea. I found this very interesting. Here we go. Quote, "The order of the priest's daily service in the temple was as follows. One of the priests arose early and bathed before the arrival of the officer, who usually came about cockcrow. The officer knocked at the door of the chamber of the hearth, and the priest opened it. He called for the priest who had bathed and ordered him to decide by lot which of the priests should serve that day. The officer then took the keys and entered through the door to the temple courtyard, followed by the priest who formed the patrol, each holding 2 torches. The patrol prepared the baked cake for the meal offering. The priest now asked one another, 'Is all well?' and received the answer, 'All is well.' The officer selected a priest to clean the altar of ashes, his comrades uttering the warning, 'Be careful not to touch the sacred vessels before thou sanctifiest, washing thy hands and feet at the laver, and see that the coal shovel is in its place.'" See the detail? The priest took the silver shovel and ascended the altar. All right, you're watching that? Pushing the large coals aside, he took a shovel of ashes and charred wood, and descending, turned northward and deposited the ashes in a heap on the floor 3 handbreadths from the altar. Then they took other large shovels and made a heap of the ashes of the altar in the center. The priest now brought pieces of all kinds of wood except olive and vine, and built a new pyre on which they replaced the unconsumed portions of the sacrifices. For a second pyre, intended for the burning of the incense, they selected the best fig wood, and having lit the 2 pyres, they descended from the altars. The officer then ordained the priest to decide by lot who should slaughter the sacrificial victim, who should sprinkle the blood, who should clean the ashes from the golden altar and from the golden candlestick, and who should attend to the sacrifices in detail. This being done, the officer commanded, "Go ye and see if it is time to commence the sacrificial service." The slaughter of the lamb was effected as follows. The front legs were bound to the hind legs, the head pointing south, with its face towards the west. The priest stood facing the west. The morning offering was slaughtered at the northwest corner, that of the afternoon at the northeast corner of the altar at the second ring. Oh my goodness. The priest who received the blood in a basin stood facing south. He sprinkled the blood on both sides of the northeast and southwest corners of the altar. This accomplished, the priest went to the chamber of hewn stone. There the officer directed them to recite one benediction and to read the 10 Commandments and the Shema, after which they blessed the people. Oh. Finally, the priest drew lots for the incense service. Here it is, the thing that Zechariah had missed. And the various assignments were made, only those who had not been previously selected being admitted to the ballot. The priests that were not to share in the service of the day now removed their priestly garments, and then, having delivered them to an attendant who placed them in the proper lockers, dressed themselves in their secular clothes, and retired from service until their next turn, meaning today they're irrelevant. Well, you get the idea. I hope that wasn't boring to you. I'm a Bible nerd. I find that really fascinating. Okay? So the ritual. Zechariah was good at this, and yet he would have wondered if it made much difference in light of the corruption at the top. And he had not been blessed with children. Even though he had served perhaps 40 years, maybe 50 years, God had withheld from him the honor of preparing the incense, right? It's beyond Vegas odds. But then, likely to Zech's surprise by this time and shock, God chooses him. This is the love of God for the long overlooked, the forgotten, the faithful priest who likely would have begun to feel irrelevant and out of God's favor, right? But not today. And by the way, we also know one other thing that put a dark cloud over all of these activities and added to the irrelevancy of the temple and the priesthood. I talked about it in some detail in the last show. The altar of incense was immediately in front of the curtains that separated the Holy of Holies. In older times, pre-exile, the Holy of Holies, again, only feet from where Zechariah would be, contained the Ark of the Covenant, the 2 gold-clad wings unfurled over the mercy seat. And, he's not the high priest, so he would never go inside the thick curtains, right, to the holy place. That was for the high priest alone. And to be the high priest, you got to have high friends like Herod himself. You got to pay bribes, and you got to control it. But inside, right, pre-exile was the ark, the table of the law, Aaron's rod, and God's presence dwelt there, mysteriously over my pay grade, but his presence was there. And again, I can't help but believe that Zech and the other faithful priests knew that when they did all this stuff in the temple to the letter, as righteous men, it was hard to take seriously all the time, right? Because they would have known that the Holy of Holies was empty. Post-exile, it's a vacuum, it's a void. The presence of God that had been there was no longer there and had been gone for half a millennia. Yet, apparently, year after year, decade after decade, faithful priests like Zechariah rolled up their sleeves, washed their hands, and appeared for duty twice a year, did their thing as the law commands. They were even taught to annually on the Day of Atonement, to the priest, to service the empty space where the Ark of the Covenant should have been and pretend that it was still there. Walk around things that should have been there and so forth. It's tragic. Again, how else could you feel but irrelevant? Why serve a God who's no longer with Israel? It's my guess that the average Joe and Mary on the streets of Jerusalem weren't aware of the absence of God. I can imagine that the elite priests who were trying to control the population and get as much money and power wanted to keep this quiet. Because if the average Jew found out, that couldn't have gone well for the leaders. But Zach knew, and still, Zach and the rest of the 18,000 regular faithful priests did their things for centuries, working in front of an empty shell. One of the narrative ironies in the entire Christmas story is that Elizabeth wasn't the only barren one. The entire Holy of Holies was barren, and in a sense, Judah was barren. But that's about to change. First, Elizabeth is going to have a child. Second, Mary will become a type of Holy of Holies when the presence of God enters her womb, right? Well, I unpacked this larger story in last year's Gospel Rant podcast. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. The title is The Gospel of the Shamed Priest, Christmas 7. It aired on December 24th, 2022. I recommend this to you if you're interested. Well, I want to close this show with the now relevant temple priest Zechariah. He is the first man who is filled with the Spirit in the New Testament, so much so that he prophesies. So just listen. Zechariah was filled with the Holy Spirit and prophesied, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come and has redeemed his people. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he said through his holy prophets of long ago. Salvation from our enemies and from the hands of all who hate us, to show mercy to our fathers and to remember his holy covenant, the oath which he swore to our father Abraham, to rescue us from the hands of our enemies and to enable us to serve him without fear in holiness and righteousness before him all our days." Luke 1:67 to 75. This is fascinating. This doesn't sound like a priest. This sounds like a prophet. Zechariah, remember, ironically, his name means God remembers, was the first in Luke to proclaim not just the coming of the Messiah, but that he has come, right? He has come. And this is before the birth of Jesus. He has come and has redeemed Israel. That's prophetic speech, looking at the future and seeing it now. God has come. It's aorist middle, it's past tense. It has made redemption, past tense. Jesus is not born. And yet Zechariah proclaims that Israel is already redeemed. Prophets, including formerly irrelevant priests, now prophets, are given amazing ability to say what has and will happen. God has come and redeemed. And I'm sure Zechariah is thinking not just Israel, but also the temple and also the world. He has not abandoned his people. He keeps his promises, and he now reigns as our Redeemer. Not due to the righteousness of the temple or the high priesthood or the regular priest or the many sacrifices that are being made in the temple. God alone has done something new and unexpected, because that's what God does. And now for the rest of his days, Zech knows that he can serve him without fear. And I think that speaks to the spirit of fear in the temple, maybe. Well, in this Christmas season, this might be worth meditating on. I have heard so many tell me that they're frustrated with the state of the institutional church. You know, I'm not going to go into all the stories. You probably know them or have your own. Too many aren't experiencing this presence of God in worship. And maybe they aren't feeling adored and loved and relevant or honored. Maybe you leave your congregation feeling as lonely and as anxious as when you came. But listen, if Liz and Zech were here, they would tell our generation that it's less about the temple, right? God indwells men and women. His Spirit indwells now in your inner being, and he adores you. His love is for those of you who feel lovable, unloved, and unlovely, for those of you who feel irrelevant and barren, for those of you who desperately long for more intimacy with him. Ask him to make you feel it this Christmas. You can do this. It's already been purchased for you by Jesus. Israel's redeemed. So all of you who are feeling irrelevant and helpless and unloved and frustrated and empty, I'm going to invite you to pick up Lauren Daigle's song, Noel. Just YouTube it, put on some earphones, turn it up, let it wash over you a couple of times. Why? Look, so that the Spirit in you will make you see just how relevant you are in the eyes of God. And just dance a little bit. It's time. You don't need to wait anymore to know God's favor and love for you as you are. Strictly because of what Jesus has done, God loves you as much as the Father loves the Son and the Son loves the Father. So look up. Hear some of the words. Noel, come and see what God has done. Noel, Noel, the story of amazing love, the light of the world given for us. So in the next Christmas, God's Love for the Unlovable show, we will see another case of God's love reaching out and touching another desperate individual, a helpless individual. But here's the thing. This man represents an entire group, one of the original tribes of Israel who were cursed by patriarch Jacob, and they've been carrying that stain for generations, for thousands of years. So what happens when the love of God bumps into the largely irrelevant tribe of Simeon? Hey, if you benefited from this Christmas podcast, please give a comment wherever you listen to podcasts. Oh, and by the way, officially follow the program if you benefited from it. And I want to thank you ahead of time. I have a new book soon to be published about long overlooked and underappreciated women in the Old Testament. We're calling it Dance, Daughters of the Most High. Some of these stories you probably don't remember. But if you're enjoying this series, particularly if you're a woman, you're going to love this book. These are stories that are worth reading and passing on to your girls. These are the little-known stories of great mothers of the faith in the Old Testament. You'll be encouraged. If you want to know when it gets published, drop me online, bill@gospel-app.com. Also, let me know what you think about the show. We love that, bill@gospel-app.com. We really appreciate it. See you next time. Take heart, child of God.